All right, well, we're a couple minutes after noon, so we will get going on this. So thanks everyone for joining us today, and welcome to our Missouri Circle Project webinar on cover crop grazing. So my name is Bethany Bedeker, and I'm the cover crop outreach manager with the University of Missouri Center for Regenerative Agriculture. I also manage the cover crop portion of the Missouri Circle Project. So if you're enrolled in that part of the project, there's a good chance I've either talked to you over phone or email recently. For some context, CRCL or CIRCLE stands for the Missouri Climate Resilient Crop and Livestock Project. That's just one of many USDA partnerships for climate smart commodities projects, but I do always like to point out that it is the only one that focuses solely on producers in Missouri. So we offer 8 different incentive programs, from cover crops to nutrient management to regenerative grazing and more. So right now we're in the middle of our first year of this 5-year project, and all of these program areas are going to continue to open annually for the next 4 years. So I will note, for those of you that are interested in enrolling for cover crops, we are reopening those applications on June 3rd this year. And I was going to see if our Molly from our team would drop that link in the chat to our website. And I'll note that we're going to be making some updates on that web page in the next week or two with some updated information for next year. But for right now, if you scroll to the bottom of that home page, you can sign up for getting emails on the Missouri Circle Project. So one of the unique programs that we offer in the Circle Project is for cover crop grazing. Soil health is one of the things that is at the core of this project. And so if you're familiar with principles of soil health, this kind of gets at adding in livestock to maximize your diversity, which can really take your soil health a step beyond what you can do just with cropping practices alone. And we really feel like Missouri producers are in a unique position to really take advantage of that opportunity, because so much of our state has both row crop and livestock production in close proximity. But this is a topic that we all are continuing to learn more about, which is why we thought a panel discussion would be a great format today, because there really is no single expert on this right now. So we have with us today 3 farmers from Missouri who are also participating in the Circle Project this year. And with the thought of this one to be as much of a discussion as possible, you can use the Q&A feature along the bottom of your screen to submit questions. Or if you want to directly ask a question, you can use that raise hand feature, which is under the reactions on the bottom of the toolbar, to come off mute and ask a question directly instead. But for right now, I will let Andrew, Lance, and Ryan introduce themselves and share a little bit about their operations. So if you just want to tell us, who you are, where you're located, how you got started, where you're at today, and then we'll start pulling some Q&A. So let's see, Lance, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. As you said, my name is Lance Dobson. I'm from Lexington, Missouri, Lafayette County. Our farm is situated just south of the Missouri River. A lot of our ground that we row crop is kind of like river bluff type ground. It's very productive. It's a wind-blown lush soil, very deep topsoil, very well drained. Our primary struggle with it has always been erosion control, because it is kind of a light soil that moves very easily with water and is highly erodible. We've been no-till for Dad started back in the 90s, and since then have continued that practice. And I think about 2016 we planted our first cover crop. It was so successful. We had some issues planting into it. We made the mistake of terminating a week or 2 before planting. It got wet, and the planter does not cut very well through rye that is decaying. Then we took a pause on the cover crop practice experiment for a couple of years, and then 2018-19 we started working with it again. And I went to a soil health conference in Boonville. Like Russell Hedrick and Jimmy from Oklahoma was there, I believe. And there was a lot of emphasis on improving soil health through diversity and incorporating livestock. There was emphasis on the incorporation of livestock, really jump starting that. And we didn't have any cattle on the operation at the time. Never thought about having cattle. But after seeing, I was kind of interested in seeing how we can incorporate that with, since we were already doing the cover crop practice, to be able to incorporate the cattle with the cover crops and trying to maximize the value and the soil health practice. So we bought our first cattle in 2019 in the spring. And then as we got more comfortable with that, as far as learning the curve on taking care of cattle and just a cow calf operation, we started putting in infrastructure on all of the land that we currently own. So we've, over the last 3 or 4 winters, we've been putting up 3 strands of high tensile electric fence wire with fiberglass posts and pipe around all those properties. There's about a 240 acre tillable tract that we currently have that around, and then another around 240 acres, open acres. So the wire and fencing, and then also developing the water infrastructure. And luckily for us, our area has been pretty well known for having good wells and water, good sources, which isn't something you think about if you don't have cattle and you have rural water these days. But you know, back in the day, that was a pretty valuable thing, and got to understand the value in that, because we've had on one property, there's a hand dug well. It's about 50 foot deep that Dad was always going to fill with sand and never did. And then we ended up developing that, redoing the pressure tanks and plumbing and wiring, and putting a new pump in it. And sure enough, we can run about 50 pairs on that well and not have much issues. And then another well that was abandoned on the other property, again, going through it, new pump and everything, and has been another very valuable source of water. So we've been fortunate there, and also using our creeks and any other water sources we have. But so that's kind of how we got to where we are on the livestock. And I don't know how deep you want me to go. If that's enough introduction, then we'll go deeper later.
Yeah, that's plenty. Well, I'm sure we'll get into some more stuff when we get to the Q&A. Yeah. So let's see, Ryan, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I'm Ryan Huelsmann. I'm actually a part-time farmer, and I have a W-2 job within the ag industry. I'm originally from South Central Illinois. I grew up on a family dairy farm, about 500 acres, 250 dairy cows, kind of very conventional annual forages. But we also had been a no-till cover crop farm for 30 plus years. So I kind of learned how to farm within this type of system of annual forages, cover crops, no-till. I didn't have an opportunity to be part of the farm. So after I got out of college, I bought a little farmhouse and a couple acres for my dad that was on the corner of one of my grandma's farms, and started off renting a few acres and bought a couple cows and just opportunistically grazed the cover crops that my uncle would plant. I'd throw a little money his way. If it got wet, I'd pull them off into the dry lot. I'd buy from him some, basically pay for the seed and the cost to wet bale some of the cover crops, so I could then feed my cows through the summer and fall and winter. Since I had a day job, I just always kind of reinvested that money back into it. And over the course of 10 years, utilizing those kind of no-till conservation practices, renting some ground, opportunistically grazing ground, finding ways to buy forages off of farmers in the area that had annual forages or cover crops. I was able to grow that into farm ownership in Southeast Missouri, the Advance, Missouri area, southwest of Cape Girardeau. So currently, me and my wife, we own 90 acres and operate 200 acres total of row crops. We have a 250-foot by 40-foot confinement building. That was a steer finishing building. When we originally bought it, we did have cattle in it. And in 19 and 20, when cattle prices were depressed and we were just getting started, we had a hard time cash flowing that, sold the cattle and got into Katahdin White Dorper ewes. So we currently have 300 ewes that we operate out of that confinement building, but we opportunistically graze field edges and some thicker, highly erodible ground that we can't farm, kind of clearing that up, as well as our cover crops. So the thing that we've kind of learned, and the thing that we don't really have, is we don't have perimeter fences at the moment on this ground. So what we do is everything is temporary. So we do 3-strand temporary electric fence, as well as electric netting, to move those sheep across the landscape. Works pretty well, but we don't have water infrastructure as well. So we've kind of figured out how to utilize old fertilizer totes and water wagons and things like that to position and run above ground hoses and poly piping to water those as we're moving them across. And that's kind of the gist of it. We plant corn and soybeans and wheat. We have that type of rotation, but no hay and no permanent hay and no permanent pasture land to support that livestock. It's all done through cover crops.
Great, thanks for that introduction, and then we'll move on to Andrew.
My name's Andrew Beeman. I'm from Central Missouri, North Benton County specifically. We've been doing cover crops about as long as Lance has. I think we started probably about 2015, 2016 in there. And there's kind of like his experience. We've had some learning curves one way or another, as far as like how to apply it correctly, like flying it on versus drilling versus broadcasting. But I always approached it a little bit differently. I always looked at it as we farm about 1,300 acres, run about 600 head of mama cows, and then we background our yearlings. But I always looked at myself as like a rancher that has row crop. So the cover crops for me were always intended to be grazed. So I always approached from that perspective. And another difference is we're a conventional tillage farm. We don't do very much no-till. So we've had quite a bit of different approaches to cover crops over the years. And the biggest thing, like what they were talking about, was infrastructure, as far as like figuring out the right type of electric fencing or permanent fencing. Water is another big one that you have to deal with. But the grazing row crop ground, because we'll graze after like we harvest corn and around field edges, like Ryan does, is that is like I think the linchpin of our cattle operation. It allows us to save so much hay over the course of the season, get them onto clean ground. It also helps us clean up the fields, as far as like the waterways, the leftover stover in the field, so you don't have such a carbon penalty on the ground from the residue breaking down. So we've been doing the grazing part for quite a while and been getting along pretty good with it, but it's been quite a steep learning curve.
Right. So we have quite a range of experiences and different things that you all have tried, and so we'll kind of just jump into some Q&A. So when we had people register, we had some early questions come in. So we'll kind of start off with some of those. And by far, the most common thing that was submitted was questions on species. So we'll just kind of start off with that on the cover crop species. How do you go about choosing cover crop species for animal performance? And then is there kind of a go-to mix that you use? And let's see, does anyone want to go first?
Yeah,
I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
let's go with Lance first.
I guess my go-to for grazing purposes, I've been using about 50 pounds of cereal rye, and then I'll mix in some hairy vetch, crimson clover, and rapeseed. Those four seem to be pretty dependable as far as overwintering and actually getting value out of. The rye is always dependable, and it can take some abuse if they're on there and it's wet, or if for some reason they overgraze it. It grows back very well. And then sometimes we'll push the grazing. Ideally, the cattle are off by May 1st or so we can plant soybeans, but sometimes we'll push that a little further back for different reasons. And the hairy vetch and the clover, because by that time in our area, the cereal rye is starting to get pretty mature and not as productive as far as from a palatability standpoint. And about that time, the hairy vetch and the crimson clover really takes off and can really step up on the feed value if you're looking to extend that more into late May. But that's kind of what we've been using for grazing purposes.
Right.
My experience is cereal rye is about the best thing you can use. It's kind of dummy proof. Like I can really put it out in a lot of different conditions and it'll come on. With my experience with cover crops, unless you get them planted like after, like if you cut silage or something like we did last year because of the drought, unless you get it established really early on, you don't get much fall grazing anyway. So cereal rye will germinate in kind of adverse conditions and come on quickly in the spring. So a lot of times we can get early March grazing with cereal rye. It can get out of hand very quickly though, once it starts going. Once the seed heads out, the cattle won't hardly even touch it from my experience. And then the quality goes down very quickly. And then it's hard to plan into also. And I think it's for our operation, it took me a while to view it this way, but the cover crop grazing is kind of like a double crop. It's incorporating the cattle in as a secondary source of income, but it's not the primary thing. So for us, like if next week it's dry enough and we can start planting, we're probably going to terminate our cover crop and get it going, even though we are grazing it. Because I'd much rather have early planted beans than grazing for another month and planting beans in like late May or something in that aspect. I've tried bob oats and turnips, and I think radishes too. I've had some success with them, but the cereal rye is the best thing I've used.
Well, related to this topic, we did have a question come in that says, do the cows selectively graze the clover and or vetch and not allow much growth on those? And then also any issues with hard seed with vetch?
Like this time of year, they're not very selective. They go to the cereal rye pretty easily, even though there's the vetch and the clover right now, there's just not much growth on it. So that's not really an issue. Just the way it's mixed, when they're taking a bite of, if they are going after clover, they're getting a bite of the cereal rye too. How we're planting it, if I'm going to graze it, I prefer to plant it with our planter. We use our Kinsey 1531 Kinsey planter, so it's on 15-inch rows. And narrow rows would be better as far as getting the more covered seeding, but the accuracy on the planter I do like, as far as there's not much overlap, or I can dial in the seeding. If I want 50 pounds on, I can dial it in pretty accurately compared to the drill. And I guess I'm getting off. Did that answer all the questions on the vetch?
Yeah, yes, it did.
I'd add something to it. They talk about selectively grazing brassicas, so like turnips and radishes. If you have younger calves, like stocker calves, they will that'll be the last thing they'll want to eat. That's been my experience with them. They'd rather eat the rye or the bob oats down before they'll touch turnips. I don't know why that is, because cattle, like the mature cows, will go for it, but it seems like younger calves, they'll eat it, but they'll be the last thing they want to eat on there.
Yeah, the clover and the vetch, if you're grazing past May 1, and if it's very warm out, and the vetch and the clover is really taken off, they will be more selective. If the rye is headed out and seeded out, yeah, they're not gonna touch very much of it, but and they will be more selective on the vetch and the clover. And one thing on the vetch, I used to get worried about. You can read different research or articles that hairy vetch can be toxic to cattle, but I've never had any issues. I think as long as they're not just eating solely one thing like hairy vetch, they're still getting some other things. I don't think it's an issue. At least it hasn't been for me yet. If that might be a concern for anybody.
I've heard that too. Was it like a toxicity thing or was a bloat problem? I can remember reading that hairy
I think
vetch.
it's the seed. Once it starts seeding, there's
Oh,
some
okay.
toxicity in the seed, which that's pretty late when veg starts seeding, as far as in the row crop situation.
On that topic of species selection, this is something that Andrew did touch on earlier. But related to planting cover crops in the fall, how does the logistics of your harvest and the timing of that influence species selection? And have you found ways to be able to plant earlier to expand the options that you have available?
For what we do, we've tried 3 different measures. Some will work decent for us last year was we ended up cutting some corn for silage because of the drought, and we were able to drill into that, and that worked pretty good. But we drilled it in like August. We've tried flying on so many pounds with like a crop plane, and it works. I think it's about the most expensive way to do it. The problem with putting it on like right around, we always think state fair time because I'm right near Sedalia. So I'd be about August 15th. The problem is if you have a wet fall, it's usually cool and you don't have very good growth. Or if you have a warm fall, it's usually too dry, and you don't have very good growth. So it's what usually like that cereal rye or whatever we use, turnips and all that stuff, it'll just sit in the ground and then just come out in the spring like normal. What we've ended up doing, I'm going to change it up a little bit this fall, is we'll graze our cattle on our corn stalks, and then we'll go in, and if the weather, if it's dry enough to do that, we'll disc the corn stalks, and then we'll rent like a fertilizer buggy, and we'll broadcast about 100 pounds of cereal rye just straight onto there, and it works pretty good. We have pretty good germination. As long as you can get it on before, I don't know, mid-December. We put it on in December before and have good spring growth. It'll germinate over the winter, and you'll have little inch tall rye, and about late February into March, it'll really take off.
Yeah, so the thing that we've experienced over the years is that if you really want to fall graze, you need to think about things like Andrew said, corn silage where you can get something out. That's never really, even being in southeast Missouri, that's not really an option. We're not seeding cover crops until November. So I do try to follow the combine with either I rent a drill or we broadcast it with fertilizer and then lightly incorporate it with a vertical tillage tool. That's the fastest and cheapest, and it works great. You get beautiful stands. You can't hardly tell once you run across it. If you just, very lightly incorporation, the drill moves more soil than lightly incorporating it with a VT. But the big thing is really for us is figuring out your varieties and your hybrids. Like, when did you plant them, and can you get them off in a timely manner? In our area, it's typically starts to rain in the fall, and it doesn't stop raining until April, May. Now this year's an exception; it's been pretty dry, but that's kind of how we don't want really long beans that are gonna, really. I'd like to have, if we can, catch the last couple weeks of October. Realistically, it's beginning of November, but I don't want to be seeding cover crops typically in the Thanksgiving timeframe. Now, to Andrew's point, it can absolutely work late seeded. But I'd like to see a little bit of fall growth. It just helps you get started that much faster in the spring.
And seeding that late, probably one of your concerns is that you don't really get any winter growth, so it's not holding the soil in place. Like you don't actually have that part of the cover crop benefit. You'll get growth in the spring, but not anything that holds soil into place. I'd definitely agree with that.
So continuing with the topic of species, we did have a question come in about, correlating that mix to the following cash crops. So do you guys change that mix depending on what you have planned for the spring?
So for me, I run the same mix on every acre, and it's a cocktail. We started with rye in the mix. So it used to be 75 pounds of rye, 10 pounds of Indian ryegrass, 3 pounds of vetch, 2 pounds of Balanza clover, and like another 1.5 to 2 pounds of rape. We've been playing with triticale and have backed out the cereal rye due to how we operate is we don't know what field we may chop, and that's dependent on spring rains and how things dry out and what's going to what are the planting dates on either the corn or beans. And so everything gets the same mix, and we just kind of roll that way. What's been chopped the year before, what we got manure spread on, things like that. So we stay flexible from that standpoint. And the reason we got away from the rye is just triticale being wheat rye hybrid is just a better forage crop. Serves the same purpose. It's a little bit more expensive, but it's that much better, especially when it comes to when we chop it. It's got that much less lignin and that much better feed value. So we go that route. But like I said, everything gets the same, and it's a pretty heavy mix, right? So there's well over right at 100 pounds of seed going out per acre. But that's all because it's being grazed and or put into an annual forage of some sort.
I think that's what a lot of people recommend about grazing is like if you're just planting as a cover crop, it's more like 50 pounds per acre. But I think grazing is you want to get closer to 100 is the standard for that.
As far as species, our primary grazing opportunity with cover crops is behind our corn crop. So typically, if I'm planning on grazing that, I'm in the field with the combine, following it, the combine with the planter, and trying to get that planted first week, second week of September to get some grazing opportunities in the fall. After typically behind the soybean rotation, we do not do much cover crops, or at least don't do much grazing. A little hesitant to plug up the ground ahead of corn since we are no-till. We're not going to go in with the cultivator to clean that up. But if we do cover crops, we are still playing with cover crops ahead of soybeans, or sorry, ahead of corn. But we're going to be a lot lighter on the cereal rye and heavier on the clovers, and less on the trying to be a little lighter on the carbon to nitrogen ratio going into corn. But we have made adjustments with our corn planter to where we can handle more residue and more nutrient tie-up that goes off with doing cover crops ahead of a corn crop, because it's a lot more. Beans are very forgiving with the cover crop, but corn is a lot more problematic. So we've put on starter fertilizers on our planter. So we're putting on 30 pounds of nitrogen with our corn planter, and also in for application to help with that nutrient tie-up. But that's kind of where we're at on our species, depending on rotation.
Right. Well, I want to switch from species to another thing that people always like to ask about, which is fencing and water. And so we'll ask, what has been your approach to fencing watering systems, or what have you seen that maybe does or doesn't work?
What we do for fencing on our operation, if there's not already a permanent fence around, which is the best case scenario, is we get along pretty good with the poly rope. I don't like how good of electricity it conducts. Like you always have shorts and stuff in it. You always have to be chasing around what part's hot or not. But the cattle see it really well. So the likelihood of them running through there is lower. And then you can get them to move to a different area whenever you take it down because they can see that it's not there. As far as the big pain with that is any sort of temporary fence, especially if you're going across around like 160 acres or 320 acres, is just the sheer amount of fencing that you had to put up. We actually just this past fall constructed we took the axle base off of an old sprayer and put like a one of those wire roller reels like you'd have for like commercial wire installation, and we put a gearbox with a PTO drive to it to roll up the fence. I should have sent a picture to you, Bethany. It's quite it looks like something you see in Farm Journal, or not Farm Journal. What's that any Farm Show, that magazine. But anyway, and then as far as keeping it hot, we've tried a lot of different fencing techniques. The best is a plug-in fencer. The best plug-in fencer would be a Gallagher. We got along really good with a Gallagher fencer. The herdsman fencers are kind of okay. But if you don't have any source of electricity, a battery one is much better than a solar one. Solar fencers they don't really put too much juice through there, through the fence. It can't keep it very hot. And you need at least, from our experience, about 4.5 to 5 kilovolts to keep stuff in. If you get below that, they kind of get through it. And as far as we'll graze yearlings and dry cows, but we have found out the hard way, do not graze, don't assume that a poly rope will keep in a baby calf. It won't. It's even if they'll just go underneath and it'll touch them. They just don't have enough surface area for the shock to keep them in. Same with all the way up to about 400 or 500 weight calves. They just don't respect the fence, and you'll end up having them out on the road and stuff and annoyed neighbors.
Hey, when I was getting started and figuring out what I wanted to do, since the big emphasis was on soil health and trying to improve the land that we have through livestock, I definitely wanted to be able to rotate the cattle and manage how they graze and be able to get enough density and nutrient cycling to where it's evenly being distributed, so that we didn't have just the cattle eating and then pooping in one area, trying to get that distributed across the whole property. So electric fencing definitely seemed like the best opportunity to do that, or tool. So like I said, in the introduction, we put up 3 strands of high tensile wire around all of our properties. In our area, a lot of the fences have gone 10 years ago. All the pastures are gone. They're being row cropped and the fence is left, which wasn't a bad thing because they were a liability anyways, probably. So we were able to start fresh with that. And when I was getting started, I did a lot of, I guess where I was going when I got started was watching Greg Judy videos. I don't know if you know Greg Judy and different grazing management guys. And I like the idea of using fiberglass posts, so there's no possibility of shorts within it, not depending on insulators. So there is no metal pipe or anything within my perimeters. So if a wire pops off the tie down, it's not going to short out anything. We have 4-inch fiberglass pipe for the corners and gates, and we just drive those in with the skid steer, tie the wire to it. And our fences are only about 40 inches high. They're not real tall fences, and so we we don't use bracing or anything. The 4-inch pipes are about 8 foot long, so there's about 4 or 5 feet in the ground, and the rest above the ground. So and we don't keep them. Ideally, they're not, fiddle string tight. We have a little sag in them, so we're not putting too much pressure on our corners. And so far, we've gone along pretty good with that. And I don't know, when we started, I think it was costing us a little over $1 a foot to put that in. I think to do it, the 240-acre field, I think we spent $10,000 invested in the fencing, which I felt like was not too bad. And then interior fencing, I use a lot of poly wire on 3-to-1 ratio reels. So that 240-acre field, I want to be able to move the cattle. I don't know if this is going to work very well, but this is the farm. And so I have perimeter around the whole thing, like I said, and then I'll take the poly wire spools and divide that out to where each swath is around 1,000 to 1,300 feet. That way, if they're in this paddock, I can take more of my 3-to-1 ratio reels and fence those off accordingly. And typically we'll move the cattle depending on our labor that we have available, how busy we are, twice a week. And sometimes if the cover crop isn't growing, we'll just we won't back fence, we'll just keep grazing across. But when it's actively growing, we will back fence and keep them off that. And that's been very helpful for our situation where we don't have permanent pasture or anywhere to go with the cattle. And so we're buying the cattle in the fall. This year we bought 50 pairs November 18th, and we kicked them out, and that's where they're going to be because we don't have anywhere else to put them, and we don't have lots and stuff like that primarily developed. So being able to move those cattle throughout the fall and into the winter really increases our how we can utilize the forage and the corn stalks, because if we just let them out on that 240-acre field, they just nip down all the rye, walking in circles around the whole farm until it was all gone, and then they start eating the corn stalks and so on. We're moving them around, they're getting a lot more diversity and an even meal every time we move them. So right now on those 50 pairs, we just started rotating around the second time a month ago. So we're just now coming around for the second round on that. And not only for grazing purposes, but being able to manage the cattle. And I couldn't imagine catching them, because these aren't cattle that we home raise or anything. They're just random cows I buy at the sale barn. I don't know them, and they don't know me. So if I just let them loose, we would have quite the rodeo trying to figure out how we're gonna. And a big thing with the hot wire is making sure if you're bringing cattle that you don't know if they're familiar with hot wire. Typically, when I bring them home, we have freestanding panels that we use for a temporary corral, and I'll put a hot wire across it, and I'll let them sit in that corral for half a day, and until I'm confident that they're walking around. Like I'll put it between the water and something that they have to go to. They have to go around that wire if they want to get to it, and if they're not knocking that wire down, I'll turn them out. But if you just open that door and there's a wide open acres, they'll just run through all your fences. But that's where we're at on fencing.
Yeah, I can concur to that. When we were grazing cows and calves, and there was always ones that consistently got out, and there was others that were scared of their own shadow once they got shocked. So on the sheep side of things, they pose a different problem because they are so small. You have to have a tighter fence, so both the electric netting and then like 3 strands of hot wire It also helps with predators. The interesting thing about the small ruminants is that if they were to get out, they don't go anywhere. They're so flock oriented that like they just don't go anywhere. They don't wander away from each other. So the whole flock might move, but they don't move fast and they don't take off running. They're very timid once they, in our confinement building, you can leave gates open and they just never really walk out, kind of thing. They have to really get to know an area before they move. So when it comes to moving fences, it does allow you to have a little bit more confidence where it's like, I do things that maybe you would never do with cattle as far as like, hey, they're in this paddock. I took down a bunch of fence. They're still standing there. I reassembled it. I moved them to another thing, and they were never actually controlled by fence for a time being. But we don't have any perimeter fencing, and so it is constant. If I had perimeter fencing, I would have probably a different strategy to grazing. Since they are so small, they don't mess up the ground at all. So you can leave them out during rain events and not have to pull them off or have like a sacrifice area. Water though, since we don't have permanent water, that's again, we figured it out with water trailers and totes on a car hauler trailer and just kind of back that up to the paddock and strategically place it. They don't drink a lot of water, especially this time of year when they have good lush green forage. So that lasts a good long while. But that's kind of it. You just kind of figure it out. But from the cattle side, I've got friends that are grazing cover crops and are cattlemen here in Southeast Missouri, and they have had some of those rodeo events where they thought they had some tamed down cattle. They turned them loose, even with permanent high tensile electric fencing, and they turn out on lush green, 40-acre, 50-acre fields, and they took off running from one side to the other and never came back. So that is a thing to maybe just keep in mind, is how do you train them before you turn them out? And then if it's like we get 50 inches of rain a year, this spring's a dry year, but normally it's sop and wet and we're super flat. What do you do during those 6-inch rain events where you've got cattle on cover crops and you don't want them messing up the ground? Do you have some sort of sacrifice area or a little place in the corner of the field that you could pull them off of, throw a hay bale out in with some water and get through that rain event? So those are things just to think through.
Yeah, and Ryan, you actually segued right into the next topic that I had, which was talking about situations when the ground is really wet, when it rains a lot. What do you do with the livestock, and maybe what are your triggers to move them out?
So we do some custom grazing with some neighbors that are no-till, and both of them we make sure it's against one of our farms that we can pull them off of, and if there really starts to rain or looks like it's going to, because it's really important not to pog up the fields if you're no-tilling. For us, it's not as big deal because we're still conventional tillage, and it will pog up the topsoil. From my experience, and I think there's some research there too, I'm not really worried about compaction, even with cattle, especially contrasting a 1,200-pound cow to that 30-ton grain cart that people drag across the fields during the fall. The compaction-wise, it's not too much of a worry for me, but it is the seed bed will get disturbed because of the hoof prints that go like 2 inches deep if it starts getting wet out. If we're doing custom grazing on people that no-till ground, or if it's a ground that we're going to no-till, we'll make sure we have a place we can pull them off of.
We don't have a sacrifice area, and that used to be a pretty big concern of mine, but over time I've gotten a lot more comfortable with rain events. Typically if we get a lot of rain and it's super saturated, we'll move the cattle faster between paddocks. That way they're not stomping in the same area over and over. I don't know, it's, some people have different beliefs. Some people feel like they'd rather just mess up one area, but they can really mess up an area if you just leave them there for a long time. And it's kind of a catch-22 on being no-till. Yeah, we don't work the ground back together, but since we're not disturbing it, the structure of our soil is very well structured to where it can hold up those animals better. If we were chisel plowing and cultivating, as soon as you got an inch of rain, yeah, they're going to be sinking up 3 or 4 inches. Where I do feel like with the cover cropping and no-till, we can get by with quite a bit with our structure. I do feel like the roots, not the big thing, and not overgrazing is if we do get some pugging and maybe a little more compaction than what we like. I don't graze the cover crop out at the end of the year. Typically I'll let it go maturity and it'll get tall and well established and rooted by the time the cattle come off to, try to break up some of that and heal some things. And that also, next year, that's why so far we're not doing very much of grazing ahead of corn either, because maybe I will do a cover crop to, try to, if we did have some pugging or compaction, try to get some more cover crops on the following year ahead of corn to keep resolving some of that. But so far we've been getting along pretty well with just moving them a lot faster. Daily moves if it's just super wet.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
Ryan, I know you said that's an important consideration down where you are, so I was going to ask if you had anything to add.
Yeah, I think a lot of it just depends on geography and topography, right? How well drained you are. If you're in southeast Missouri with pancake flat fields, if not graded level or 1 degree, slope type thing, where water doesn't move off quickly. We don't have any graded fields that we farm, but they are pancake flat and old sloughs and river bottom type grounds. We just have a lot of standing water now. Because we are no-till and cover crop, we handle that water a lot better, but there's still the issue of, when you have these major rain events. I know it was August last year, but we had what was it, 23 inches of rain the first 3 weeks of August. And typically half of our 50 inches of rain comes in February, March, April. And so when you're talking about 25 inches of rain with pancake flat, those are the challenges we have with just spring grazing, things like cattle. It's why, other than the financial aspects, the sheep for me serve that niche of I don't have to have that worry of like, what are they going to do to especially the rented ground. It's not so much my own ground that, I get concerned of. It's, when the landlord drives out there and he's like, what I'm doing is drastically different than the neighbors who are, furrow irrigated. They're pulling beds right now. There's 4 or 5 tillage passes, things like that. They burn off the wheat stubble, and I'm, baling, wheat straw. I'm the only one in the area with livestock. So those types of things, I've got to just be cognizant of what are the optics here, so that I can continue to do the different thing on the rented ground.
Yeah, so now just kind of switching gears to, management of that cover crop. What height usually is the cover crop when you turn in the livestock? And then also, do you kind of graze it one time and be done, or do you also look to get some regrowth and put them back out there?
I hinted on a little bit of it earlier, but we'll try to plant it first, second week of September, and typically by the end of November, we'll have 6 to 8 inches of growth, ideally, if we have the right weather. And we'll start grazing at that time. And yeah, we'll graze till May, just rotating through our paddocks. And like I said, we started November 18th, and middle of February we started back around on our second rotation, which luckily the weather in February was pretty favorable. On the green up has been a lot earlier than most years, so we started regrowth quite a bit. But you'd be surprised, even in the winter, if you get some mid 50 degree days and sunshine, how much it grows back once you graze it. But overgrazing can definitely be an issue, especially we're talking about compaction and wet spells. The more growth you have, the more the ground can tolerate wet spells and everything. That root structure underneath, it can be a very beneficial web to hold the cattle up in the wet conditions. But if you don't have much growth, it's going to be harder to maintain that.
So we usually get ours out about too late to do any fall grazing. We had a couple fields this past year that we were able to, the ones we cut for silage. But in the spring, I look for, once it starts tillering, it gets maybe 2 or 3 inches tall. I'm comfortable do like kind of low stocking rate, like maybe 1 cow per acre. So we've got like 160, you could put up to 160 yearlings on it, or cows even. For me, I try to stay in front of it. That rye can get away from you so quick that I try to stay in front of it and get it grazed, so it doesn't start, getting 1.5 feet tall. Then before you know it's headed out, and then they won't hardly touch it after that.
Yeah, I'd say we're in that 6 to 8 inch mark. So we've had the sheep on cover crops for, I don't know, 3 weeks or better now. I'd say the thing that I've learned is that, at least in the cover crop side of things, is if you've got a plan for more than what you have, because you never know how often you need to move them. They might go, you might not have a correct stocking density, and all of a sudden you turn them out and you come back a day or 2 days later in your paddock, you're like, oh shoot, they ate a lot. I've had that happen, I don't know how many times. But I try to move more often than what maybe they would, leaving more biomass. And then if you do that and you do kind of get to the end of the field, or however you're rotating them around, you can come back, if you plan it accordingly. But a lot of it is just staying flexible and just kind of looking and seeing, and checking them every day, twice a day, whatever your comfort level is, and just making sure you kind of understand what forage is available to them today, what you got for them tomorrow. And at the end of the day, though, if you're grain farming for cash, at some point you do have to make that exit strategy. Like, okay, how far am I going to take them? When am I going to get them off? And kind of plan that, reverse engineer that a little bit too, where it's like, hey, I'd like to have this field grazed and not have it get out of control, like Andrew said. And I want to plant first week of May or whatever. That means I need to move them how many times between now and then. And so you just kind of have to figure that out. There's probably not a straight answer, at least in my mind.
Yeah, I think density is a big factor in what your goal is. I mean, if you're wanting to put a lot of cows on a small amount of acres for a short amount of time, you probably need quite a bit of growth if you're just going to do a short-term grazing. But for me, where I'm wanting to spread it out throughout the fall and into the spring, I have a pretty low density rate. We're 50 pairs on 240 acres. It's like 5 acres per pair to get through the winter without feeding much hay. The only hay we fed really is during the snow events we had for about 2 weeks of hay feeding. Other than that, it's been on forage, and I got the big factor on how you're going to manage when to put them on, what your feed availability is and what your goals are.
From my experience, this is just, you mentioned the hay thing. If you have to feed hay, and sometimes you do because it like freezes over in the winter, or you might get short on something, don't unroll it in the crop field. That's been my experience. That'll really screw up when you're either trying to work around no-tilling into it. You'll have that'll be a wet spot and it won't grow anything, or vice versa. It'll be different. It'll be different to manage than the rest of the field. If you're going to unroll hay, have like a designated like grass strip or like a waterway that you do it into, because it's really hard on the crop ground to unroll hay into it, and that's where they'll pog it up really bad. I have I'm not an intensive grazing with the cover crops. From my experience, and it has to do some with my soil. I have a lot of clay in my soil, so if you do really high intensity, they really mess up, like tear up the soil and kill the cover crop out. From my experience, I will actually, like if I got like a 80-acre field, I'll just turn the cows out on the whole 80 acres. And then they do a decent job of keeping everything uniformly grazed. If it got to be too low of a stocking rate, it would be a problem. Like if I just turned like 5 cows out on 80 acres, they would just stay in one area and overgraze one area while the rest grows. But if you stock it correctly, they will keep it pretty uniformly eaten.
Yeah, great. Well, we've been having a lot of great discussion, that our hour is pretty much just about done here. Maybe we'll
On the hay unrolling, I'm a little contrary on that too. I actually do roll it out on the ground, and typically I'll do it where if we've done some dirt work and built new terraces, a lot of times I'll roll those out on those terrace cuts. Just that's where I want the manure, because that's what needs it the most. Trying to build that up, and that may be a difference in, my soil is a lot more silty, loamy type. There's different situations for everybody and what their experiences are, but
that seems very reasonable. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
But it is unrolling the right amount can be very tricky, because I want them to be able to clean it up within a day. If they don't have it cleaned up within a day, then they start wasting more. It's pretty hard to judge unless you have a snow on and that's the only thing they're going to eat. But if you're trying to roll hay out and there is just a little bit of green or anything else they can eat, it's pretty hard to judge how much to roll out without them wasting a bunch. But it hasn't, making sure that we're not just leaving big piles of it, it hasn't been an issue planning into. But like right now, you can't tell where we rolled out. It's green. It's not covered with, the hay hasn't, killed out the rye. It's thin enough, but yeah, that's what we do at least.
And a lot of you hitting on the soil type, I think it's really important. A lot of the research and information about like grazing row crop ground or cover crops is from stuff I read is like Nebraska or some Western states, or states that actually the ground actually freezes in the winter, which makes it a lot easier to graze stuff if you're not worried about tearing up the fields. And then whenever I tried implementing some of it down here, you had a lot of different experiences because we had mud instead of frozen ground. And that's where the trial and error stuff comes in. And just because it works on one person's farm doesn't mean it's going to work on yours.
Yep.
Yeah, well, we're kind of at the end of the hour here. So just to maybe wrap it up, if we each want to take maybe, I don't know, under 30 seconds of what your advice would be to somebody who's thinking about doing this, but maybe not ventured into it quite yet.
I'll start. You have to start somewhere, but I would start with a well thought out plan and just know that you're almost certainly going to have to make adjustments. But maybe what is not advisable is just on a whim, enter a program and then go to the sale barn one day and throw up, a strand of hot wire and turn them loose. That's going to be a bad day for you probably. So really having a well thought out plan, putting all the stuff in place prior to you actually turning the livestock out, and then knowing, hey, this may not work. I may have to make adjustments, based on what happens. But I wouldn't embark on a unless you're an experienced stockman, I wouldn't embark on a grazing journey in front of your cash crop without it being pretty well thought out and planned.
Yeah, I would highly recommend you do it. I think that's one of the most profitable parts of our cattle operation, and it helps a row crop out a lot too. Huge cost savings because in the fall, when you're able to graze crop residues and some fall growth, you're not feeding hay, and then you're able to start grazing in the spring up to 2 to 3 weeks before you could be grazing like your fescue. A lot of cost savings. It's good for the ground. It puts the cattle onto ground, like clean ground. Like if you have cattle that you're worried about getting sick, they're not on pastures all winter long. Let your pastures rest. It's really good for that too. Important, make sure you keep the fences hot, keep water to the cattle, and a hungry cow will move themselves. It doesn't matter how hot your fence is. So always make sure they have forage there. You can tell when they don't because they'll move themselves and you'll have a lot of problems.
Yeah, as someone coming from not having cattle previously, it can be very rewarding for me at least, incorporating cattle into the farm where we've been removed from livestock for 20-30 years. And I have kids and my parents have grandkids, and seeing them being able to interact with the livestock is pretty rewarding, and just adding more value to the farm is pretty neat. But definitely, like in my situation where I didn't have my own cattle, if you're in that kind of boat, I would definitely work with somebody else who has cattle maybe to start out. I've done, before I started buying cattle, I've done some contract grazing with friends who had a cow herd, and just doing a daily rate, and then you have somebody to consult with if you have an issue, and they can help you out and give you ideas and tricks of the trade as you get started and comfortable. Because I know starting out, when I didn't have good fencing and wasn't really sure of myself, there's a lot of kind of sleepless nights wondering what the cows were doing. So that can be kind of overwhelming, but yeah, just maybe start slow, but it can be pretty cool. But I think there's a big opportunity going forward with livestock and what we're doing, because there's a lot of consumers who are concerned with some of the production practices, maybe, whether I'm not smart enough to know what's right and what's wrong, but there's definitely consumers who are interested in other ways of raising livestock that may not be something alternative to confinement and stuff. And this seems like a really good opportunity to incorporate livestock onto more acres and land. So
Great. Well, with that, I'll just kind of wrap us up and, close us out. So I'll just thank everyone who hopped on today for joining us and contributing to this discussion. Obviously, I think we could keep talking for a lot longer, but we have to stop at some point. So obviously, there's still a lot that we all have to learn about how cover crops can be used for grazing and how to manage that. But this kind of discussion, if firsthand experiences is just really helpful, both for farmers who are interested in this and also for those who work with farmers as well. So what I'm going to be doing is I'll be sending out an email to everyone who registered for the webinar today. And I'll include in that, a link to some other resources that we have available through the Center for Regenerative Agriculture on this topic. And then, as always, just feel free to contact either me directly or our Circle Project team with any questions about the project, and we'll be glad to help. And then I just want to say thanks again to Andrew, Lance, and Ryan for sharing their time and experience today. So I hope everyone has a happy Friday and a great weekend ahead, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bethany.
Yep, thank you.
yeah.